research and information skills. It's week 10. We're down to the business end of the semester. And I imagine you're all getting rather stressed about completing your final assignment. I wouldn't worry too much at the moment, in the sense that I'm hoping that you've progressed through the early stages of the project. My hope is that as we progress through the weeks, that you'll be on top of these things and find hopefully the writing process to be somewhat of a pleasure, as much as these things ever can be. Anyway, this week we're going to be looking at critical reading. And the reason I've left it so late in the semester to kind of delve into this, because by rights it could have occurred much earlier in the semester, is that I feel that actually finding material and being able to evaluate that material to be probably far more important, certainly in the initial stages, than the actual reading. You need to obviously find the material to be able to critically read it. Anyway, this week we're looking at the span of critical reading and how that might play into critical thinking skills as well. I won't labour that point, although I've put on a document on Milo to actually support this and how the two intersect. But more importantly, I want to look at how we might approach reading from a very different perspective. So what I want to cover really is some sort of notion of what is reading, then look at the elements of critical reading, and then possibly questions you may ask when you are reading. And I mean, you'll see those in the session outline. Perhaps I'm simply reiterating those, but it's worth noting, I guess, the path we're on for this particular lecture. I want to start the lecture really with slide 3. And this is an activity that I normally do in class and ask students to consider their approaches to a range of different material. Looking at those examples that I've put, for me personally, I would approach each of those listed there, when I say those, I mean the books listed there or the reading material listed there, quite differently. For instance, with an introductory to architecture book, I'd expect personally some wonderful pictures and drawings, etc., illustrations that would highlight that. And I guess my aim would be to enjoy the architecture as opposed to necessarily understanding it, unless of course I was an architecture student. But for me personally, I would approach it in a very different manner than, say, the second one, which is much more of my interest and much more of my background, which is an essay by a prominent sociologist. I'd be looking at what are the arguments, how do they connect to other theories within sociology, what evidence does the writer actually pose or present, and how does that inform my own knowledge and understanding of sociology. Another passion of mine, which is history, and I studied history right up to, certainly in my first degree, right up to a majors level. I'd be kind of interested again in perspective. How does this particular historian account for this thing? Do they have the qualifications and obviously the actual position? So were they a witness to this, for instance, which it says, the first-hand accounts, obviously they were. And did they have the vantage point? So could they have actually seen what they're saying they have seen? A brief lyric poem, I might kind of look at more or less as a whimsy. In other words, that I would look at it perhaps in almost a romantic, possibly sentimental way, so that how I read the actual poem would be very different again. A magazine, an advertisement, for instance. Personally, I loathe advertising, so I probably would spend little or no time on the advertisement. I might very briefly look at the actual picture of the advertisement rather than reading the blurb that went with it. And having done media studies with students in the UK, we looked at deconstructing advertising and how there's different ploys or different devices used within advertising to actually draw our attention. A novel for pleasure, I see that as a probably Saturday afternoon thing where I'm quite happy to immerse myself in terms of an imaginary landscape. And a novel for literary analysis, which is very different. And if you've studied English, you'll understand this, that you're looking at the structure and the style and the language used, for instance, to understand how an author or what devices an author has used to actually convey meaning to the reader. Now, in each of those cases, for me, all of them would involve a very different view, a very different outlook about how I'd approach each book, and how that outlook would actually then transpire or transfer into the way that I actually do the reading. So, for instance, a magazine advertisement which I ignore would be very different, for instance, from an essay by a prominent sociologist. I would know for a fact that I would have to put very little thought, if any, into looking at a magazine advertisement, but I would have to put a lot more thought into an essay by a prominent sociologist. So my reading with the sociological essay would be much more methodical, much more reasoned. I'd be attempting to ask much more critical questions than I would with a magazine article, or advertisement, I should say. In fact, I'd be very dismissive of the latter. Equally with a novel, for instance, because I would see it as very much a relaxation activity, being able to immerse myself in some sort of imaginary world that an author has created for me. Again, I would see that as somewhat disposable. I wouldn't read with nearly the same intentions or clarity, and maybe not even with the same concentration. So in other words, that whilst I'm in my imaginings, I may actually miss lines, I may miss words, I may miss even whole paragraphs, and it was not really going to matter too much. Likewise, with a lyric poem, I may be interested in one or two lines in that whole poem, but I'm more interested in the actual response that it creates in me, so the emotional resonance, for instance. So anyway, the bottom line is each of these, from at least from my perspective, involve a very different approach, and that then informs how you actually read the magazine, or the actual material, I should say. On slide 4, I look at reading in a general sense, and I suspect this is common to most people who've been educated, certainly in Australia and elsewhere in the Western world, that we're often prescribed texts by teachers or lecturers. We then read those texts, we're told what the meaning of those texts are by our teacher or lecturer, and we generally construct knowledge based on that interpretation of what we've read. We don't look further. And I have to say, I've certainly suffered from, when I was younger, certainly suffered from the second part of what I've said in that slide, which is many students read at surface level and tend to give up when the going gets tough. And there's reasons for that, obviously, because we're not accustomed to reading for depth, because we've generally been told what a text means by someone who's an authority, as I say, a teacher or a lecturer. We often find it very difficult when we have to do it on our own, so independently. The other point that I make on that slide, on slide 4, is that we don't actually approach text with a questioning stance. We often assume, in a rather receptive state, that what's being said is, I guess, is logical, reasonable, etc. We don't necessarily want to probe further for the assumptions and the intentions of the author, which can, if we do probe, change the whole meaning of a text and call into question maybe the propositions that have been put in there. Perhaps the most important slide for today is slide 5, where I've said to read for understanding, students must learn to actively engage in a silent dialogue with the author. What that means is a conversation with the author, and actually kind of questioning what an author's saying in a way that you're having an imaginary conversation. So if you were standing face to face with that person and you had questions, or at least wanted to discuss what's being put forward, this is the kind of process that you'd undergo. But also, more critically, that you'd find a connection between critical reading and disciplined thinking. So in other words, that your thinking informs your reading and vice versa. So there's a symbiosis between those two factors. Now, I have to say that I make no presumptions and would never belittle the fact that reading academic articles is difficult, as I state on slide 6. And there are so many reasons for that, and I won't necessarily go through them all, but even the language, the presentation style, etc., that often the knowledge being presented is specialised and is inaccessible to us, certainly at our rudimentary stage of learning, for instance, literally at the beginning of your studentship, if you want to call it that. And so there is a lot of difficulties, and most students confront it in one way or another. So don't feel alone in that respect. Slide 7 outlines the relationship between critical reading and critical thinking. And as you'll see there, essentially critical reading is about discovering information, and critical thinking is about evaluating the information that we read, for instance. So can we accept or believe the propositions being put forward in a text, for instance? More critically, critical reading refers to a careful, active, there's the key word, active, reflective, analytical type of reading, whereas critical thinking involves reflecting on the validity of what you've read in light of the prior knowledge and understanding. And by validity, I mean, is something logical? Is it rational? Is it reasonable? Does it make sense? Does it follow in terms of flow of an argument, for instance. So there's no jumping to conclusions that don't have any sort of valid build towards that conclusion, for instance. Slide 8, I more or less put critical reading in a nutshell. So I cover the previous elements, I guess a revisory or a visionary, I suppose, slide, which covers the 5 essential points that you have to obviously read actively and critically. You construct knowledge as you go while you're reading. You take a questioning stance as you read, and you probe for underlying assumptions or intentions, and you engage in the difficulty of the process. So in other words, if things are tough and you're finding it difficult to get through a particular, journal article and so on, it's worth perhaps persevering for as long as you can. Get up, move around, do something different, and come back to it. What I would say is that having a dictionary beside you as you read, or a textbook with a glossary in it, for instance, of terms beside you as you actually do the reading, may help you kind of bridge and link some of the concepts within a text. And often this is the case because the language or jargon is quite dense, and because, the reason it is because it's written for other people in that particular academic discipline. But anyway, those 5 points need to be enacted in some way. And slide 9 deals with some of the ways that you might be able to actually execute this particular approach to your reading. Now, some of the most basic ways of actually engaging in the activity of critical reading are listed on slide 10. Using a highlighter, for instance, and pens and pencils to scribble. I think personally, annotating is one of the best ways that you actually generate questions and write them in the margin of a book, for instance, or a photocopy, I hope, not necessarily a book from the library, that you actually kind of begin to employ an interactive approach to your reading. So in other words, you're responding rather than being receptive. You're actually actively engaging in the material. You're responding in some physical way by doing something with it, even if it is asking more questions, which again, somehow you're going to have to resolve. But to me, that's part of this process. Slide 11 is perhaps the raison d'etre for this particular lecture, which is the goals of critical reading. So what are they? Obviously to recognise an author's purpose, so why they're writing the particular thing that they've written, to understand convincing elements of a particular argument or a piece of writing, to recognise strengths and weaknesses. What you have to avoid, I think, which is critical, is simply the rather mercenary approach of what information can I get out of this, in terms of doing an assignment, etc. Because it means that you're not actually necessarily learning the material, you're just simply finding it and employing it in a certain way, which doesn't demonstrate understanding. Questions you should be asking: how does this text work? In other words, how is it put together or structured that actually helps you understand the particular topic that's being written about? How is it argued? So what is the structure of the argument? What evidence has been used and how is it interpreted? And does the text does the text have valid conclusions? And all of those things you can do as part of the process of reading. Now, on slide 12, I look at and discuss the objects of scrutiny. And there are several things that you can actually, I guess, apply your forensic eye to when you're actually doing reading. Some of those things might be the evidence provided in the account, whether the reasoning of the author's argument follows logically to the conclusion that has been drawn, whether you can actually, I guess, perceive or there's some indication of the author's values and assumptions. Now, this is often easier when you're reading emotive pieces that are in newspapers nearly every day about certain issues, whereas academics attempt to be much more objective and much more reasoning in their approach to writing, for instance. The other thing is the link, and that you can begin to do this when you have a broader understanding in a particular discipline, is the match between the author's claims and claims of other authors. So as you see the writings of different authors in a particular discipline, you are then more able to compare those two authors and see whether there is conflicts, and if conflicts do exist, whether those conflicts are reasonable and justified. And inevitably, the last point, which is the match between the author's claims or predictions and the reader's own research, evidence or knowledge. So this comes back to, even though you may have some doubt about your own knowledge and your understanding of a particular issue, it's worth I guess, looking at and comparing what you know about a topic and what's being presented, and whether that fits or sits with your existing knowledge. If it doesn't, then obviously perhaps you need to then step up and improve your own knowledge about a particular area. But sometimes things are stated that you simply don't agree with. They don't sit well for you and what you know about a particular area, and you have to navigate a way through that somehow. Usually through more reading. More personal questions for you as the reader come in slide 13. The 5 critical synopsis questions, which help you kind of figure out why you're actually reading a particular text. Questions like, why am I reading this, which is fundamental and basic. Obviously, questions like, what are the authors trying to do in the writing? What are the authors saying that is relevant to what I want to find out? So in other words, is it a foundational text? Does it inform everything you're trying to write about? Does it inform an aspect, an angle, for instance, a perspective? Obviously, how convincing is the author? And this often can be garnered from whether other authors cite that particular author. So in other words, is their work seen and respected in such a way that other authors in that particular discipline use them as a resource or a source? Now, slide 14 more or less covers what we learnt about the authority test. So when we were way back weeks ago evaluating information, again we begin to employ these same questions, these same areas of concern, I guess, where we actually apply questions and ideas that to make up whether we can actually use that source or that's an authoritative source. Questions like, is the author qualified to write about the subject? Is the important information missing? And a range of things like that. We would extend that to all of the questions in our evaluation, though I'm hoping that most of you would employ those before you actually even began to read. Slide 15 is the activity. It's a handout, which is Critical Reading Practice 1. Work through it if you can. We're going to be working through it in class. I suspect it should take maybe 15 to 20 minutes. I've yet to try it out. It's a new one for me, so the timing is a little bit out, or maybe a little bit out, I should say. But give it a go anyway, and I'll put the answers up on. Sorry, actually, the answers are actually already on page 5. So I tell a lie. I was going to actually erase them and put them in up the following week, but perhaps it's better if I leave them there, just so you can check your progress. Or is that just a way of me covering up my laziness? Anyway, moving on rather rapidly. Anyway, in slide 16 we look at, or at least I look at, 4 tips for critical reading. And I won't necessarily go through those tips here. They're extensive. Certainly the first one about reading a paper 3 times. Yeah, 3 times. And sometimes that can be incredibly difficult in terms of timing. You simply don't have the time to do these things. But what I would recommend is maybe doing a truncated version. So briefly run through a paper, and then perhaps with the 3 other points after number 1, maybe, like I said, attempt to employ a whole range of things that relate to these 2 slides, slides 16 and 17, and do them in a way that suits you. If I was to summarise the 4 levels of critical reading that you're going to employ, slide 18 covers the first, which is skimming. So our preliminary understanding of a particular thing. We look at perhaps the title, read the abstract, we'll identify the main themes, for instance, and may get a general sort of understanding of what the article's about. Then on our main reading, and this may be, as I said, condensing the latter points of slides 16 and 17, is we go for a comprehensive understanding. We read, carefully in a concentrated, concerted way to understand what the variables and the concepts are involved, what the terminology has been used, or what's the main ideas or themes, and then obviously we need to come to some sort of reckoning with it, so we restate in our own words. So if we got asked, and this is the way I like to look at these things, if we got asked in the street, what does this particular paper mean? So if we were asked that question, which we often do in essay questions, we could actually state it in our own terms, using our own language, our own vocab, etc., which for me is an important part of academic development, conveying ideas, etc. Other aspects of critical reading levels, on slide 20 we look at analysis understanding, so we understand the parts, begin to critique, and obviously we put things in our own words where we need to. And synthesis, where we put together our response, particularly in an assignment. We explain the relationships between different concepts, for instance, that even span other aspects of a discipline. So we actually look at concepts that may not necessarily be in the text that we're using, but maybe previous text that we have used, and we critique that. So we make some sort of definitive judgment about what a particular text represents. To finish off the PowerPoint, I've broken up the different aspects of academic papers, and I've put things like abstract, methods, results, discussion, etc. I don't think I need to highlight those. I think most of you would have encountered them by now throughout different aspects of the course that you're on. I think really it's just a way of looking at, okay, what are these things? How do they work in principle? How might they help you to actually find out what a paper's about? And I've said before in weeks gone by that I think perhaps the best place to start with any paper is by reading the abstract. It gives you the essential statement about what the project's about. It will state the purpose, the methods, the findings of the research. It'll also give you some recommendations, and in a sense it's a whole project condensed into 150 words, for instance. And to me that's important. It gives you literally a keyhole to look into a study, and then ascertain whether you can actually use the work that's been done, in that particular journal article, that particular research, whether you can actually use it in your own work. And that's important because it saves time. And I'm a great believer in efficiency, which is not laziness. Anyway, I've put a revision slide down on slide 29. I'm just hoping that everyone can have a quick look at that, and then maybe that they understand the points that I've put there. For those attending, we generally will probably have a look at a few journal articles for the last activity, and I'll get students to unpack the different aspects of a journal article in class. I think more importantly though, after we do that, which perhaps would take half an hour, I think I'm looking to actually encourage my students to get back to their projects. Given that that's the final part of this particular lecture, I want to say that so I'm hoping that everyone will crack on with their obviously their projects, and that if you do have any difficulties or you're having problems, by all means contact us, because given that it's week 10 this week, you should, I hope, have identified a topic, written a proposal about it, had that accepted, looked at doing and drafting your research plan, and beginning to look at possibly a writing plan, although weak. What I'm hoping for is that by next week you're at the writing stage of your project, so you've done all the preliminary research you need to do. Obviously you'll be doing supplementary research as you go along, and then from there you'll be looking at using that as a platform for actually writing your project and obviously getting it in by the due date. I've said several times that it's very difficult for us to give extensions. That's because it's very close to the end of semester and we have to have our results in at a certain point, maybe perhaps a week or two after the actual semester ends. I know that's an academic constraint on our part, or a bureaucratic one perhaps, but nonetheless we're all bound by deadlines. Anyway, look, I hope you all have a great week, and yeah, good luck with your projects. By all means contact me if you need to. Many thanks. Bye.